Good day. There is still a dearth of news about what is going on the Ukrainian battlefields, except that Denis Pushilin, who is the head of the Donetsk regional government, has come and said that there's been significant progress made by Russian forces in Marika, that the Russians are continuing to make headway in Bakhmut, and that they're also making progress in a place called Gorlovka, near Gorlovka, which is also another town in the Donetsk area. Another one of our regular commentators, if I can put it like this, Lieutenant Colonel Marasco of the Lugansk militia, has also said that Ukrainian troops in the Krasny Limon area, as he puts it, the Liman area, in other words, in northern Donbass, in northern Donetsk region, are now very short of ammunition. I'm going to return to the topic of ammunition shortly. Alongside all of these reports from Russian sources, which, as I say, don't tell us a huge amount, there was a very interesting report in The Guardian which admitted that Russian electronic warfare is now becoming increasingly effective in preventing Ukraine's effective use of its drones. And there's some suggestions that Ukrainian use of drones will become much more difficult within the next few weeks or months. One Ukrainian soldier put it up to 4 months, but that might be an optimistic estimate based on some of the other things that were said in the article. Meanwhile, we've been getting more and more information about the Russian Air Force being much more active on the battlefronts. There was reports of more Russian airstrikes in the north, around the Zarublets River. I'm not quite sure where that is, but apparently it's somewhere on the front lines, and I get the sense that this is somewhere in on the northern areas of the battlefronts. There's also been more Russian airstrikes apparently in the Avdiivka area, and also, and importantly, in the area of Orekhov, which is this town in Zaporozhye region, which the Russians approached in January, and which appears to be the main base area for the Ukrainian offensive when it's about to happen. And in fact, it's increasingly clear to me that the main balance of Russian air activity has now shifted from, or is gradually shifting from missile strikes, though it's important to say that these do still take place, but from missile strikes to bomb attacks with precision-guided bombs. Russia's been using its 500-kilo precision-guided bombs in Ukraine for some time. They were the bombs that were increasingly used in the Avdiivka area, for example, leading to the major Russian advances there. But Russian precision-guided bombs of 1,500 kilos are also being used increasingly in the battlefields. Now, when I say this, I would say that this is not yet remotely an air campaign on the scale of what the United States would launch, say, against Iraq back in 1991 and in 2003. We're not looking at air campaigns on that kind of scale. I doubt that the Russian Air Force has the air assets, sufficient air assets, to conduct an aerial campaign on that scale. Its missile campaign, by the way, has been on a much bigger scale than anything that the United States has ever undertaken. But its air campaign has clearly been smaller. That's partly because some Ukrainian air defense systems still undoubtedly survive. The Ukrainian air defense system still exists. It's not been completely extinguished. So the Russians have to be careful. They can't send fleets of aircraft and fleets of bombers operating over Ukrainian battlefronts and Ukrainian cities and over logistic centers, in as if there was no Ukrainian air defenses to speak of. I think it's also a function of the fact that Russia anyway has a much smaller air force than the United States does. It's a powerful air force by the standards of any country other than the United States, but it is significantly smaller, very much smaller than the Air Force of the United States. So I don't think that Russia actually has the capability to conduct an air campaign of the kind that the United States regularly does in the various wars that the United States fights. But maybe the Russians calculate that they don't need to. And I would point out that given that precision-guided aerial bombs don't use rocket or jet engines, apparently after they're launched, for most of the distance that they travel, they operate in a kind of automated mode, so they don't actually they're effectively jam-proof as well. They're much more simple pieces of equipment than cruise missiles are, by way of illustration. That means that using them must be an awful lot cheaper than using cruise missiles and long-range missiles like the Russians have been doing. So from a Russian point of view, it makes complete sense now that they can operate their aircraft increasingly over Ukraine, that they should be using more bombs and in more quantities and doing probably more damage with these bombs than some of these cruise missile strikes can. Certainly no Russian cruise missile carries the amount of explosive in its warhead that a 1,500 kilo bomb, kilo bomb can do. And I think if we're talking about attacks on bridges, that basically it makes more sense, in fact, to use these bombs than it does to use these missiles, as I've speculated about in the past. Now, before I leave this particular topic, I would say that it's been interesting to see that the Russian Air Force has been using bombs increasingly against bridges. And given that the Russian Air Force doesn't have a huge amount of experience in using precision-guided aerial bombs, certainly not the sort of experience that the US Air Force does, I suspect that some of what is going on is basically the Russians familiarizing themselves with the techniques, learning how to use bombs and how to use them most effectively. So they're launching bomb attacks on relatively small bridges for the moment, using, so far as I can see, only 500 kilo bombs at the moment. And of course, as they gain proficiency and understanding, perhaps they will start to deploy the bigger bombs, the 1,500 kilo bombs against bridges